I want to make a couple of comments about the presentation, several presentations earlier regarding the schools, and particularly to Dr. Lake and colleagues. John Cook, I had a nice visit with him, the principal of the middle school. Our two daughters, and I want to first of all introduce the mother of those two daughters, my wife, Pastor Deb Kielsmeier, who's here backing me up with several friends I want to mention shortly. But I want to say something regarding Dr. Lake and the schools. Our two daughters are graduates all the way through, starting with the school just down the street, Brimhall, all the way to the middle school and the high school. And they are accomplished in their professions and laudable as parents. And you can't do any better than that, I think. So kudos to the schools that they came from, and to all the educators in the room, whether you wear a formal education badge or whether you're encouraging young people to grow and learn. No matter what your station is, however you reach young people in a positive way along those lines needs to be encouraged. I want to say a few things about others who are here, just briefly. I want to mention my colleague and friend, Joe Nathan, columnist, a champion. I don't know if Joe was able to stay or not. There he is. He hides out in the back as good writers do and gets all the good stuff. Joe is a champion of youth development, positive youth development and service learning, longtime colleague and co-worker with me. I want to also introduce at the same table Mariam. And Mariam is a friend from Somalia. I've known Mariam for many years and knew her husband, the late Prime Minister, and have benefited mightily from our relationship and working together around issues that we share with regard to the Horn of Africa. At the same table, and it has already been mentioned, Amy Muirs is here, who is the CEO of the National Youth Leadership Council, more than my successor, an endorser, and somebody has taken the organization further and wider than I could ever imagine, and appreciate mightily that she's here to back me up a bit. So appreciate Amy Muirs. Getting me here, along with Kurt, I would like to acknowledge especially Terry Gorham. Where's Terry? And if the PowerPoint works well, thank Terry. If it doesn't, well, we tried real hard together. But seriously, Terry has been a terrific ally and friend. Others in the room, Don Salverda is here somewhere. There he is, longtime friend through the Optimist. And someone who is not here that I'd like to acknowledge, the late Don Craighead, who probably introduced me to the Optimist. I can't remember when. He came on later, or earlier, as a board member at NYLC and a great encourager. And the epitome of all the values that you espouse. So greetings to Don wherever he is right now. I'll probably miss some other folks who I should acknowledge in the room, but the setup on all this has been just terrific, and we'll take it from here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of young people in society today and how we can come alongside them, not just to provide traditional forms of nurture, but come alongside of them as people who have a lot to contribute. And with with your help, Terry, if I miss a place to start us off.
Just go with that down arrow.
You got it, the down arrow.
You just
Just the down arrow. It's always good. It's always good. Okay. Okay. The typical transitions to adulthood in our society relate to these things: school completion, leaving home, hopefully being financially independent, starting families, having children. But to bring them along in a positive way requires other ingredients, I believe. And those ingredients relate to the way that they can contribute in life. Whoops, got the wrong one. Sorry. That one. Got it.
Yep, is that it?
Yeah, next one. We set this up this morning. And I wasn't listening very well. Okay.
Did it work?
Yeah, there you go. I want to I want to start with kind of where I started, because it does say something about who I am and where I come from. I graduated from college with a commission in the U.S. Army, trained as a paratrooper and as an Army Ranger, and was deployed in Korea. This is my platoon, pictured on the left. But more importantly to what I have done since is the development of relationships with people who came alongside of me. And that's the reason I mention that as a former soldier and as a person who has invested in and been invested in himself by others is to note the work that I did together with Lieutenant Chung Young Bok, pictured with me somewhere. There he is. No, next one, sorry. He's the person on the right. Lieutenant Chung and myself patrolled on the DMZ, but more importantly, Chung and I created a program that brought the capacity of young GI volunteers to work in Korean schools to help in the teaching of English. Korean schools at the time, and they were rural, where we were, did not have people who were formally trained in English instruction. And so having someone alongside the English teacher who spoke English from their lived experience was extremely important. And so Chung and I put together a program, brought it forward to my commanding officer, bumped it up to the assistant division commander, and it stopped. And it stopped cold. But then Chung and I found a way to get access to the division commander, the 2-star. And so we walked into his office. I was equipped for the high technology of the time. I had a map and a pointer. And I could handle those. The long story short is that the 2-star overrode the 2 1-stars that had blackballed us. And we took it forward. And that became the basis for what happened next, not only in Korea, but my career thereafter, working with people and teaming with people across races and cultures and lived experiences that allowed things to go forward in a positive way. I learned tremendously working with Chung, and we were able to be successful. I went on from there to some graduate education and discovered that there was a way of working in service along the lines of what we were doing in Korea, which had to do with non-military national service. Whoops. And Key to that understanding was the writings of William James, who in 1910 wrote a famous essay called The Moral Equivalent of War. And it predated World War I and did not have a lot of influence on World War I, but became the reference point for many of the programs that followed in American public policy, including the most significant program and the most lauded program coming out of the New Deal, which was the Civilian Conservation Corps. Any of you here have direct experience through a relative with someone who was a part of the CCCs? I can see your hands. There are important camps that were built here in Minnesota and around the country, and several 100,000 young men who participated in those camps. The model was good for the time. It put money in the hands of young people who needed to pass it along to their families who were having difficulty making ends meet at home, and it provided a source of work for reforestation and other things. It, however, was flawed. It was available only to young men, and it was only available to European American young men. And so even though we give credit to the CCC, it was a starting point for what we now know as non-military national service. It was a beginning. My father happened to be a camp surgeon at one of those camps, and my oldest sister was born in one of those camps. And so I know a little bit about that from them. Following on the heels of national programs and national initiatives was the Peace Corps that came about through, a lot of people credit as the initiative in particular of John F. Kennedy. But John F. Kennedy borrowed the idea from, who would you guess it would be as the senator from Minnesota? Hubert H. Humphrey, yes indeed. Humphrey put the idea forward first and then was defeated in the primaries by Kennedy. So Kennedy was the Democrats' candidate. He took the idea and ran with it. And you know where it went from there. Any of you have a connection with someone who has been in or a part of the Peace Corps experience? Look at the hands. That's a tremendous legacy from years past. Currently, we're in an era where the opportunity to serve full-time as a young adult are still available. And again, we can look at Minnesota and Minnesotans who pioneered that. The first statewide commission on national and community service was what state? Minnesota, right. And it was Hubert H. Humphrey initially who put together the idea for the Peace Corps that Kennedy borrowed, and it was also his son, the former Attorney General, who headed up the initial program model here in the state. Later on, it was Rudy Perpich, Governor Perpich, who caught on to the idea of service and service learning. And I was just a young professor at the University of Minnesota, and he had heard the work that was going on and called me into his office. And you know, Rudy Perpich, the governor, calling you into his office. I said yes. I'll come by. But seriously, Perpich had been in Duluth and had visited a couple of high schools. One of those schools had young people who were participating in volunteer activity, tutoring younger students, and he asked them, and then he went to another school and asked the other high school the same question. How many of you are participating in some form of service or contribution and so on? And asked them to raise their hands. The second group, almost to a person, a young person, raised their hands. And then he went back, and he's telling this story. So he said, I went back and asked, what was the difference between the two classrooms? Two different high schools, almost identical curricula. The difference was that the school that had young people who wanted to contribute and serve in volunteer activities with young children were young people who would come out of a service learning type experience. Everything else was the same. I mean, not a scientific sample exactly, but at the same time, it caught Ruby Perpich's attention. 2 months later, at his instigation, the National Youth Leadership Council, hosted the first National Service Learning Conference at the University of Minnesota. And we went on to do that year after year. Amy, how many years is this next one coming up?
34.
34 years of that conference, but we can thank the late Governor Rudy Perpich for his initiation. Moving on from there, we brought the idea of service and service learning forward to other people at the national level. And again, a touch of the Minnesota is involved here. Some of the first program models were brought together as a part of the work that we were doing in my case, initially in St. Louis, and then in various areas in the upper Midwest that involved bringing together young people of different races and cultures around the shared experience of contribution. Kind of a version of what they do in the Peace Corps and what happened in the military, and happens now in the military often, if it's done right, that involves people to share an experience of significance across their cultural base. That program went on to become what we now call service learning. And there is a curricular base to it, there is an evidence base to it, and there is significant participation in every state in the country. My colleague here, Joe Nathan, is one of the champions of service learning and has written extensively about it and practiced it as he's worked with young people. Ask Joe about service learning. In St. Louis, we worked in community gardens and brought forward the idea that young people could be supporting the idea of effective food production. The base behind, and then also in adventure activities. One of the things that I got involved in that has been something that I continue to follow is working with and through as an instructor, initially in the Army, through military training, but later with the Outward Bound schools. So I worked in Colorado, and I worked at Dartmouth, where we ran projects and programs that brought young people together around, again, intensive shared experience across cultural lines around a shared objective. I mean, that's supposedly what the military does. Can't we do it in a non-military type way as well? Bring people together around doing something that is positive, like building bunk beds, Kurt, together. And why can't we bring that idea across communities with our young people? And that's what we call service learning when it's done right. We know from the research that in terms of retention, that what we're doing right now, maybe it's a little bit better because I got some AV behind me, but a straight out lecture at the top of the pyramid in terms of retention leads to very little pure retention. If you read about it as well as hear about it, or have some AV alongside of it, and then build more experience behind it with demonstration, discussion groups, and then practice by doing an application of what you're doing. But if you ask young people to participate not only about learning robotics in a hands-on way, I got 5 more minutes, okay, I better quick. Learning robotics in a hands-on kind of way, but teaching robotics to kindergarten children, that's faster. Let me give you one example. We all recognize that picture. In New York City, the mayor of New York went to my friend Teddy Gross and asked him, what can we do to encourage the firefighters and police officers and the people who lost loved ones when the towers came down? And so Common Sense New York came up with the idea of young children putting together celebrations out of their schools for the survivors and the surviving families from the towers that came down. Common Sense then went on to bring that idea forward to many communities where they have great loss. And young people host their peers and their parents around things like that. So that's what happens when young people come together to do something that's really positive. And as Jenny and other educators in the room know, when young people stand up and stand in, excuse me, that's important to me, you see a lot of things happening. So that's what Common Sense was about. And they put together something called the Penny Harvest, which in New York City and in Rockefeller Center, they put together literally hundreds of thousands of pennies, pulled that together to support these kinds of celebrations for the people who had survived the tragedy when the Twin Towers were taken down. Standing in the breach. They can do it. So, and then we have the example of Dr. King. I came out of the 60s. I was at his funeral in Washington, D.C., on the Mall. And so just his memory just brings me to a deep feeling. So the idea of greatness, he said, who is greatest among you should be your servant. It means everybody can be great because everybody can serve. People have taken that idea and that concept of selfless service, and that's why you have the Martin Luther King holiday. But tagged onto it, you know what else it is? It's the Martin Luther King holiday day of service. And it came out of the influence of Dr. King and many others who went before him and continue. And so when you participate in that, think of service and service learning, if you will. I do. Well, that's it for me. Because I don't have any more time, but I've got a lot. I got a lot more stories. But anyway, the notion here is that teaching and learning should require a challenge, and it doesn't necessarily mean needing to go into a military service. There's a way of serving that can come out of your experience as an educator. I found it. Joe Nathan has found it. Mariam has found it. Amy Muirs, others of you have found it. It's a way of learning that academics have found as it reinforces not only the ability to contribute, but there's a way of reinforcing cognitive development as well. Hands-on learning with a giving dimension. That's what service learning is about, and that's what several of you in the room know about firsthand. Let's build it into the way we raise our kids and encourage the schools to find a way. Thank you.